Hello again, we're back with part 2 of my Xiaolonin video with the first focus around her kid. You probably know how she works already, but if not, you can go check out my or other content creators' videos about it. I'll sort this section by element and team types, and we'll be using the common and or best versions of the team type. With that out the way, let's get right into it. Starting with what we shouldn't do, because the list is much shorter and also easier to explain. First, we are not using Xiaolonin in an Anemo nor Dendro main DPS team for two reasons. One, she doesn't shred these elements and is the same reason why we don't bring Kazuha in these type of teams. Two, you're not going to shred or heal because she doesn't convert the two required elements, as you're likely to be going double Dendro or Anemo. We are also not using her in a mono geo. Editor you here, I didn't realize from the version 3 change there was another part for Xiaolonin C2. This actually allows her to be run in mono geo teams, as Xiaolonin's geo sample source will always remain active. So for you Itto mains out there, good for y'all if you want to pull for this. Also, version 4 is out, and it's only wording changes besides the C2 where they buffed it once again. And with that out the way, let's start with geo teams. Wait, wasn't geo cooked? Yeah, just mono geo. With a geo DPS, our team is already capped out on the non-sample units, so we need two more teammates from the FEC elements. And through the process of elimination, we can figure out the best team. Two of our DPSs are defense killers, but we can't use Geo anymore, so Goro is out of the picture. The best option thus would be Furina, who gives a universal damage bonus, while also applying Hydro for Navia. For the last slot, the best option for all three is actually Bennett, as there's literally no one else that buffs. Thankfully, these characters aren't pure defense skillers, but just attack skillers who get a defense conversion, which I bet many people forgot, including me. Moving on to Pyro. We first have our standard double swirl core, which consists of Bennett, Xingqiu or Yelan, and lastly Kazuha. Basically, every Pyro DPS can use this team, but while this team is strong, it has some notable weaknesses. 1. You're limited by circle impact. 2. You generally cannot Kazuha burst or else it steals vapes. 3. The setup causes Bennett field to last like 1 second shorter for your DPS. For this team, you can take out Kazuha but not Bennett. Taking out Bennett makes it impractical to swirl Pyro on the enemies, if not impossible for characters like Hu Tao or Gaming. By taking out Kazuha, it becomes easier to play, as you aren't required to do the double swirl setup, but you do lose out on grouping. Overall, it is a side grade. Similar to this is the double swirl Furina variant. Unlike before, you cannot control when her summons apply Hydro, making it super inconsistent when swirling enemies, with me usually not getting a Pyro swirl from Kazuha, so aka no VV or damage bonus. Just like before, we can't switch out Bennett, but we can switch out Kazuha. In this case, it is an upgrade switching over Xiaolonin, as you generally would have trouble swirling Pyro with Kazuha, unless you really need that grouping. Next will be the Pyro double Hydro core, with either a Bennett or Xianyun variant. This team, while it can be used by the other Pyro DPSs, is commonly used by Hu Tao, Gaming, and Diluc. Switching out Bennett for Xiaolonin is a straight up upgrade, as 1. Xiaolonin amps damage more, and 2. You're no longer bound by circle impact. Now, when switching out for a Cloud Retainer, this may be a downgrade for Gaming and Diluc, who really need the plunge attacks. This can, however, be an upgrade for Hu Tao, as she does not need the plunge attack playstyle. As such, she isn't losing too much when losing the plunge attacks, for a lot of shred and damage bonus. This is also because Cloud Retainer is unable to VV Pyro generally. Next is Mono Pyro, which almost always uses Bennett, Xianling, and Kazuha. This is used primarily by Linny, as his kit requires it, and Dea and Klee, who don't really output the damage too well by themselves. So who do we replace? Well, you can actually replace either, in my opinion, with it being based on what you need. If you need grouping, replace Bennett. If you cannot battery Xianling without Bennett, then replace Kazuha. But if you like the team already, then don't replace anybody. But from a damage perspective, you will gain a damage increase from replacing Bennett rather than Kazuha, as she simply amps your damage up more. For Linny in particular, getting Xiaolonin C1 for the interruption resist will be really good. And if you are using Zhongli instead of Kazuha, C1 Xiaolonin will be a big damage upgrade if you can dodge and position well, but if not, just stick with Zhongli. There aren't too many good forward melt teams, so I'll just skip them. I know they can do a lot of damage, but they're usually really impractical, okay? Overload uses Chevreuse, which cannot use either Kazuha or Xiaolonin, so I'm also skipping them too. As such, we're moving on to Hydro now. First, we have the typical vape team with Benny, Xianling, and Kazuha, which is commonly used by Child, but can also be used by Ayato as well. If you want to replace Bennett, just consider this. 1. Battering Shanling will become a bit more difficult. 2. You will likely be unable to swirl Pyro, and as such, your Shanling loses out on a lot of damage. So while your Hydro DPS will do more damage, this wouldn't be an issue if Shanling wasn't half of your team's damage. If you replace Kazuha, just consider this. Kazuha can shred both Pyro and Hydro while getting them their damage bonus because of the double swirl setup. But Shallonen cannot practically double crystallize for the hero set. As such, she misses out on some of the damage bonus, but she still does shred. This occurs as the elements will often remove each other's aura, thus requiring a more complicated setup, or you just ignoring it outright. This is actually really important, which I and probably many others glossed over. As such, for this team, I believe it would be better to not use Shallonen. For the rest of Hydro, because the DPSs has such different teams, I will separate it by DPS instead. Starting with Neuvillette, because he has a lot of teams, I will just be going over strongest one. That being Furina, Kazuha, and the Sustain, which I will be using Baizhu. This one is pretty easy and you just replace Baizhu, now having 2 Kazuha on the teams, making it arguably the best team in the game. Now that we finally have a team which uses both Kazoo and Shallonen, let's talk about resistant shred stacking. From my previous chart, we know that the more res the enemy has, the better res shred becomes. But if enemies generally only have around 10 resistance and Kazuha and Shallonen give 76, well, what happens? Well, going by this, the effectiveness of res shred decreases by half when the res goes below 0. Say the enemy only had 10 resistance. Kazuha would shred the first 10, leaving you 66 more res shred. We then simply cut down this by half, giving us a total of negative 33 res shred, rather than the expected 66. Though I currently don't know the specifics of the damage lost by this, I just know the more you have under 0, the less damage amp there is. But it doesn't matter too much in Neuvillette's or our other DPS's case, cause it's the best damage amp they're gonna get. Now to Mualani. I've seen 2 main variants of her team, including a Sustain. The first will be a Burn Vape with your Dendro and Pyro of choice, followed by a Zhongli. This one is pretty obvious, as to have a Burn Vape team, we need Burning. As such, we'll just replace our Sustain with Shallonen, which is fine as Mualani has super high interruption resist at 0.15, which is the second best in the game after 100% interruption resist. This is just a straight up upgrade from Zhongli's 20% res shred and maybe 35% damage bonus if you have Archaic Petra. There's also a Kazuha for a Zhongli version, but it seems fairly difficult to play, so I'm not really mentioning it. The other variant I've seen will just be the regular Vape team. Unfortunately, there's quite a few versions I've seen, and I don't know which one's the best one, so I'll just give a rule of thumb. If there's a Bennett, he 100% is getting replaced. If there's a Kazuha and Zhongli, replace based on the playstyle you prefer, or don't if you like it already. After that, we have our Hyper Bloom team, which we don't need to replace anyone as Shallonen cannot shred Dendro to increase Hyper Bloom damage. Lastly, we got Mono Hydro, where we simply replace Kokomi as she does not amp our damage as opposed to a Shallonen. I don't know who would actually run this, but hey, who knows, I would just put this here anyway. Of course, for Nilou Bloom, we can't use anyone besides Dendro and Hydro, so no Shallonen here. Now for Electro, there's 3 main team types: Aggravate with Nahida, Aggravate without Nahida, and Quick Bloom. Again, I will be skipping Overload in the same reason for Pyro. Starting with this Nahida variant, the core is Nahida and Fischl with a sustain of your choosing. Basically, every Electro carry can use this team, and once again, it's pretty simple, we just take our sustain, as Shallonen shred and damage bonus is much more than a slight damage boost to Aggravate and Dendro Resonance. You could use Kazuha instead of Fischl, but I would advise against this as you will not be swirling Electro. Next, the no Nahida teams. This core generally consists of Fischl and Kazuha with a Dendro sustain. This team favors a quick swap playstyle which Cyno cannot really keep up with. We of course need to keep Fischl and our Dendro so we can aggravate, but is it an upgrade to switch Kazuha? I would say no, for a few reasons. 1, the team shouldn't have an issue swirling Electro. 2, you will lose a lot of damage without Kazuha's personal damage and him triggering Fischl's A4 passive. Lastly, Quick Bloom. Using our Electro of choice, we have Furina, Nahida, and Baizhu. Clearly, we need a healer, so do we replace Baizhu? Yes, we do. Now we got Cryo. There are just 2 teams of note, that being Freeze and Melt. Starting with Freeze, it will actually be separated by the solo Hydro, so either going Farina or the healing Hydro route, like Kokumi or Barbara. Kazuha or Venti are core pillars, as Freeze really needs the grouping to make up for its lack of damage as opposed to the other reactions. Starting with the Farina variant, we have the core of Kazuha and Farina with a sustain. I will be using Charlotte as she fits this slot the best right now. So of course, we can't replace Kazuha in this team, so the sustain will be replaced instead. Doing this loses us some cryo application and resonance, but we get Shallonin's buffs in return. This is an upgrade in these teams, but just note that Risley and Aiga can potentially struggle with swirling cryo due to their lack of off-field application. Moving to the healing Hydro route, we have Kazuha, Kokumi, and generally a Shenhe as its foundation. For this team, we cannot replace the Hydro or else we can't freeze anymore. So do we replace Shenhe or Kazuha? This actually just depends on what you need, but I would say Shenhe, as to keep the grouping and be no longer bound by Shenhe's quill limit. As such, Shallonen would be a buff to this team as well. We'll next go over the two melt variations. The traditional melt team right now has a core of Bennett and Xianling, who are basically inseparable. This last slot is either an animal support like Kazuha for a more offensive team, or a shielder like Xiangling for Ganyu. Again, we shouldn't take out Bennett, so it'll be Kazuha or Zhongli getting booted. Talking about Kazuha first, a core issue is how you have to swirl cryo early in order to get the shred and buffs. But by the time you get back to your cryo DPS, BV is nearly gone and you have a really short window of optimal DPS. Switching to Shallonen increases this window by 5 seconds, and with C1, you can also get interruption resist for someone like Ganyu. So yeah, a really nice upgrade seeing how you use Freeze for AoE and Melt for bosses. Just like before for Mualani and Mono Pyro Lini, it's up to you if you prefer Zhongli's Comfort or Shallonen's Damage Amp. Next is Burn Melt, and just like Burn Vape, there's honestly quite a few variations, so I'll say there's a Dendro, Pyro, and often a Flex for the last slot as well. The same logic would apply here too, where you replace the Flex slot, which can be an upgrade from Zhongli and Kazoo. And that's that. I hope this breakdown was useful and can better inform your pull decisions. If you have team questions or ideas, I'll be happy to answer them or just look at them in the comments. My next video is actually going to be about Divergent Universe 8 because it got updated because someone asked me in the comments, and Rappa afterwards and not Xiangli Yao. I'm sorry, I don't have time right now because school's kind of kicking my butt. But besides that, thank you for watching and peace out.